Hello, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to this webinar. This is part 3, the final one of the trilogy. We've been doing webinars through this week, a collaboration between ADAS and the Met Office as part of Countryside COP3. For a while now, ADAS have been working with the Met Office on research to help identify ways that farmers can adapt their practices to build resilience to climate change, whilst also strengthening the UK's food security. And this week's webinars were set up to highlight the challenges and the opportunities for UK agriculture to build resilience to the physical impacts of climate change. On Monday, we heard from farmers and landowners about how the weather and climate is already forcing them to make long-term decisions and analyse risks season by season. There was another webinar yesterday where we were discussing the supply chain, looking at the risks around the world and talking about how those risks have increased at each stage of the supply chain process. Both days, Monday and Wednesday's webinar, data featured heavily in the discussion and access to it, the need for more of it, and also a lot about communication. There was a need and demand for more and better and simpler communication when it comes to climate change and the risk for each different sector. Today, though, what are we talking about today? Well, we're talking supporting a resilient agri-food sector. What are the big questions that decision makers face? Obviously, it's aimed more at policy makers, but hopefully it will make for interesting listening to anyone in the agri-food sector. Now, before we get into all of that, before we introduce a couple of speakers, a little bit about me. I'll be your chair for the next hour. My name's Alex Deakin. I work for the Met Office, have done for 25 years. My main role is a weather presenter, so pointing at imaginary clouds that aren't actually there. I've done that for many, many years, and for 16 or 17 years, I actually did that on the BBC, fortunate enough to present all the main weather on the news programmes across the BBC, including on Countryfile many times as well. I still do a little bit of TV weather forecasting, but my main job now is here at Met Office headquarters, Exeter in Devon, presenting on YouTube and social media. Increasingly over the past 5 years, my role has involved more climate communication as well. But I am a meteorologist. I'm not a climate scientist, although I do work with some of the best climate scientists on the planet here at Met Office HQ. Now, it's my job as chair to keep everyone in check. So if you could, please keep your cameras off and your microphones off as well. But that doesn't mean we don't want you to be involved. We really do. And I'll go through how we can do that in just a minute. But before that, one more final thing I need to point out is that by being part of this webinar, your name is visible to other participants. So if that is a problem for you, please log off and find some way of logging on anonymously. We are going to have a panel discussion, and we do want your questions into that panel discussion as well. And the way you can do that is by using something called Slido. So up on the screen now, you've got a little QR code, which you can scan using your phone, and that will take you straight to the right website. And you can answer questions there. We're going to have a couple of polls in a second as well, but you can ask questions to the panel. So if something comes up during the discussion or during the presentations you want clarification on, you can ask questions on there. And the other way to joining is just putting in slido.com into your browser, but you need to use that number there, that hashtag COP3-3. So please get involved in that. We do want you to be involved, asking questions, but also first up, we want to know who's on this webinar, who is listening in. So if you could fill that question, a couple of people coming straight in, brilliant, well done. What type of organization do you represent? So we can get a kind of flavor of who is on this call. 33% government or arm's length bodies coming in. So yeah, if you've not used Slido before, just scan that QR code or use the slido.com website. And it's really easy to use. Government and arm's length bodies still top 35%, industry 22%, consultancy 17%, farmers we've got 13%, student 8%, and NGO around about 4%. Is that everyone who's voting? No, still coming in. Thank you for that. Thank you for being involved. Change in numbers by 1% or 2 here and there, but mostly it's government and arm's length bodies and industry making up over 50% combined. Brilliant, thank you for that. Before we get into the presentations, though, one more poll, if you will. This is the last one for now, at least. want to know, what is your understanding of NAP? Are you aware of and familiar with the National Adaptation Programme? So you've got 4 options there. Never heard of it. I've scanned it briefly. I'm aware of it, but not read of it, but not read it. I am familiar with its content. So they're the 4 different options. People not heard of it. Over a third. Almost a third are aware of it, but haven't read it. The number of people familiar with its content is single digit at this stage. Scanned it briefly. Quarter of you. Okay, just let that sit there for a few more seconds. Any more votes coming in? That's really, really interesting. Okay, so over a third have not heard of it, and almost a third aware of it but not read it. Thank you for that. Thank you. I'll still a few more votes coming in. That will stay open, so you can keep voting on those. And I said, do please use that platform, that Slido platform, for questions if you think of anything that you want to ask our panel when we get round to it. But before we get onto our panel, we do have a couple of presentations. Today's webinar is mostly about adaptation. When we talk about climate, there's 2 big things about how we handle it: mitigation, which is where we try and reduce the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. This is obviously a large scale issue and relatively easy to measure. But adaptation, we know that the climate is changing. We know that we need to adapt to the problems we've already caused ourselves. So adaptation is obviously place-based. It depends on where you are, and it's harder to quantify. So our presentations today were mostly focused around adaptation. What mechanisms are there to support an agriculture and food sector that is resilient to climate change, and what are the big decisions that decision makers need to make to support this transition? First up, we saw him earlier, and now we're getting him back. Here's Brendan again. It's Brendan Freeman. Thank you for being there, Brendan. Brendan is a senior analyst at the Climate Change Committee. He leads the work programme for climate change adaptation within the natural environment, land use and biodiversity. Brendan, the floor is all yours.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Alex. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to you today. As Alex said, my name is Brendan Freeman. I oversee the work programme for the natural environment and agriculture within the Adaptation Secretariat of the UK's Climate Change Committee. Today, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the CCC's work to assess risks and opportunities to UK agriculture from climate change, and also a bit around the actions being taken and that need to be taken in order to address the risks identified. Next slide, please. Before I do, however, I thought it'd be useful if I provided you with a little background as to the CCC's responsibilities. Now, the CCC itself is an independent, non-departmental public body formed under the Climate Change Act to advise the government and including the devolved administrations on tackling and preparing for climate change. Now, under the Act itself, the committee has 2 statutory functions in relation to climate adaptation. The first is to produce a national level assessment every 5 years of the latest evidence on the priority risks and opportunities to the UK that require urgent adaptation action, and this includes risks and opportunities to agriculture. Now we're up to our 3rd, with the last produced in 2021 and the 4th well underway, publishable in 2026. The government then responds with the national adaptation plans, which outline the plans and actions that they will be taking. And then that brings me on to the 2nd statutory function for the CCC, and that's to produce a report for England and also, where requested, those for the devolved administrations, scrutinising progress in adapting to the risks that we've identified. Now, this takes 2 parts. The first is to look at how they have delivered those particular plans, and the second is to look at the effectiveness of those particular plans. Now, 2023 has been a particularly busy year for us because we've had to produce 4 reports over the course of the year, and I'll talk a little bit about the findings from those reports in the next slides. Next slide, please. Now, the nature of agricultural production means that the sector is particularly vulnerable to shifts in the UK's climate. And the last risk assessment looked at risks and opportunities to the UK under 2 climate change scenarios relating to a 2 and 4 degree rise in global temperatures by the end of the century. Now, under these scenarios, multiple risks from climate change to agriculture were identified, including things relating to changes in average temperatures, shifts in rainfall patterns, and also shifts in seasonality. Now, in terms of the impacts, it was found that climate change may alter the magnitude, frequency, and duration of flood events. Particularly for agriculture, it was found that high-grade agricultural land is particularly vulnerable to flooding, be it from river and coastal sources, and this is projected to increase significantly over the next century. Changes in temperatures are also found to potentially result in impacts to soil moisture, such as increased soil erosion, or impacts such as increased soil erosion, and also carbon loss to the actual soils. Now, impacts may differ regionally, particularly when we're looking at agricultural production in the southeast of England, which is already seeing impacts from dryness and water scarcity having impacts on productivity. Now, this will have considerable consequences for agricultural crop production going forward. And I think the 2018 summer is a really good example where we saw considerable impacts to crop production, such as salads, which severely declined in terms of their productivity, and also dairy production, which had indirect impacts due to sharp declines in forage for cattle supplies. Now, with the frequency of summers such as the one we experienced in 2018 projected to increase from 1 in 5 or 1 every 5 to 1 in 2 by 2050, this could have significant implications for agricultural production. CCRA3 also identified some opportunities to UK agriculture under a changing climate, such as new or alternative species which could be grown in that climate, or other things such as longer growing seasons. But the risks that were identified by far overshadowed any opportunities that could be yielded. Finally, the assessment found limited evidence of adaptation actions being implemented to respond to current and future climate risks, and it noted a significant adaptation gap in responding to the risks. Now, I would say that we are aware that significant adaptation activity is happening at the on-farm level. However, it's poorly recorded, and therefore it makes it very hard for us to measure the level and effectiveness of this autonomous activity. This is something we'd like to get more data on going forward. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned before, 2023 has been the first time that we've completed assessments of adaptation progress across all of the 4 UK nations. The scores are shown in the bottom box on screen now, but in terms of the actual scoring itself, we take a two-step approach to the assessments. The first, we look to assess the quality of the plans and policies in place, so looking how much climate change is considered within those plans and policies. And secondly, we look to assess how the actual risk itself is being managed. And we draw on a range of different indicators where available. So in terms of policies and plans for England and the DAs, the assessment found that policies and plans do have the potential to support agricultural resilience of agricultural productivity going forward. However, each was at various stages of development, and the different scores across each of the countries is largely down to the level of detail that we currently have from each of the governments on each of the plans. I would say that most show significant ambition. However, many were lacking specific details around the types of adaptation actions that would be eligible for financial support under the various schemes, including ELMS in England, and also the effectiveness of or monitoring of how effective these plans will be, which will be key to looking at ensuring that we're spending the money in the right places. So on that, our ability to monitor how the actions already taken by the sector to adapt to climate change has been greatly hindered by a distinct lack of data. So for England and Wales, we simply don't have the access to the data that we need. So we're unable to evaluate those in terms of reductions in vulnerability for the sectors in those nations. Indicators for Northern Ireland suggested insufficient progress, while for Scotland, it appeared progress was more mixed. Again, data remains a significant limitation, and this will be vital going forward if we're to robustly monitor the scale and effectiveness of adaptation within the agricultural sector. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are we actually talking about when we're referring to adaptation actions? On screen now, I've listed a range of different interventions that, where appropriate, could reduce vulnerability of agricultural production to current climate change and also future climate change if delivered effectively. So first is around reducing exposure to droughts through measures such as improved water efficiency. So this can include things such as water reutilisation, or also improving the ability to capture and store water by increasing on-farm water storage capacity infrastructure. Now, I appreciate this is very expensive, and this may be an area where government needs to step in and provide more support to the actual industry itself. Agricultural soils also need to be in good condition to support productivity, and this is particularly under future weather extremes. So sustainable management techniques such as reduced tillage, using cover crops and incorporating organic matter to reduce erosion will all help to insulate against this. Climate vulnerability can also be reduced through the selection of crops and livestock that are more suitable under shifting climate conditions, particularly for crops, but also greater diversity as well in terms of the types of crops that are grown under shifting climate conditions. Now, while the measures relating to agroforestry and hedgerows planting can support a range of adaptation benefits, we'd like to see more of this where appropriate because of the sheer benefits they can provide. And these can include a range of different things, including reduction in soil erosion by providing buffers around the actual agricultural land areas, improved flood mitigation, on-farm shading to insulate against more extreme temperatures, and also they provide habitat both for pollinators, a key input into agriculture, and also predator pest species. So managing another key risk that was identified in the assessment. On-farm flood mitigation efforts such as finally, CCRA3 identified pest pathogens and invasive non-native species to be present serious risks to agricultural productivity. Now, there's an urgent need for additional action to improve preparedness around this, and this can be around improved surveillance or creating habitat and predator pest species habitat, as I mentioned earlier. Finally, things such as flood mitigation efforts, again, planting of hedgerows and trees, that can provide a range of different benefits, but particularly around slowing flows and improving soil structure to improve infiltration. So there's a range of different, by no means exhaustive, but hopefully that's provided you with an idea of the types of adaptations we would like to see more of. Next slide, please. Okay, just finally, I wanted to share with you some work that we've been doing within the committee to develop what we're calling adaptation monitoring maps. Now, there's a range of different reasons we've been developing these. First is to enable us to provide a more quantitative answer to the question, is adaptation action at a sufficient scale to effectively manage the climate-related risks that we've identified within our assessments? But also we're hoping that by clearly laying out the adaptation process, we can apply our current indicators more effectively, but also identify areas where new data needs to be collected to better measure the steps in the process. Now, we've developed one monitoring map for each of the 13 systems that we look at. And the one on screen now is for working land and seas. So as the name suggests, this tries to or attempts to assess the how land and sea, well, to ensure that land and seas are being managed effectively within the UK. Now, I should add that at the start that the maps are still very much a work in progress, and we're looking to develop them over time as our understanding of climate change and adaptation improves. But the method is organised across a number of different steps. So looking at the top, firstly, we look to identify an apex target for each of the subsectors. So subsector within this one being agriculture. And in order to measure an overall level of resilience, what types of things that we would like to include in terms of indicators would be assessing things such as livestock mortality, or even areas such as abundance of pollinator species. These could both be outcomes which we would be looking to assess to measure resilience within the sector. We also include a range of sub-outcomes within this that support adaptation. And again, these are underpinned by a range of different indicators. So the ones that we've currently identified are things such as take-up of sustainable farming measures. So things such as the ones I spoke about in the last slide around water storage capacity. Another outcome could be aspects which can support healthy soils, a key input into agriculture, and also outcomes around planning, such as for wildfire and pests and diseases. Now, the next step within the monitoring maps looks at enablers. Now, these are the types of aspects that are needed to deliver resilience outcomes, but they don't necessarily support resilience directly. So these can be factors such as ensuring funding and investment is available, be it from government or from alternative sources such as the private sector, and also things such as making sure the sector has enough people with the right skills to support the types of adaptation that are needed. And then just finally, the final step relates to the types of policies and plans that need to be in place to support the sector in its efforts overall. Now, this can either be new policies, so we've identified gaps and we feel a new area or policy or plan is needed, or alternatively, tweaks to existing policies and plans so as to ensure they have sufficient consideration of climate change within them to make sure that they are climate proofed both for now and into the future. Now, as I say, I see these monitoring maps as evolving over time, and we would very much appreciate support from experts, both within policy, academia, and I guess most importantly from within the sector itself to help us as we develop them going forward. So please do get in contact. I'll stop there and I'll thank you very much for your time and hand back to Alex. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brendan. Really interesting. Again, just data popped up yet again. So that's all of the webinars through this week. But thank you very much for that, Brendan. If you've got any questions around that, then I'd say please do use the Slido facility to ask some questions. Panel discussion coming up shortly, but one more presentation first from Charles Ffoulkes. Charles is a director within the climate and sustainability business at ADAS with over 10 years experience. He's a chartered geographer supporting clients with climate change risk assessments, adaptation strategies, TCFD reporting, and building business resilience to extreme weather events. Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. So yeah, I was going to say a few words around the National Adaptation Programme. The poll we just ran was very interesting, and if nothing else, at the end of this, I'll walk away very happy just knowing that at least a third of the people will have now heard of the National Adaptation Programme, because it's, yeah, definitely something we should be familiar with as much as possible. So let's just go to the next slide. So in terms of what the National Adaptation Programme is, DEFRA, as part of sort of legal duty under the 2008 Climate Change Act, have to produce a National Adaptation Programme every 5 years. This usually follows a year after the publication of the latest climate change risk assessment. The idea of the programme is to set out the actions that government and others will have to take to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And what was released earlier this year in July was the third national programme. So this provides the responses to every risk and opportunity that was outlined in the third climate change risk assessment. The actions outlined cover the period from 2023 to 2028. And the idea of the programme and strategy itself is to have the vision that we have a country that effectively manages climate risk, is fully adapted to a changing climate, and with resilience against each of the identified risks, we can sort of build a more resilient society. The plan itself covers 5 core areas. So we have health, buildings, and kind of built environment. We have the natural environment, business and industry, infrastructure, and then international dimensions. So what we're interested in today really is the natural environment, which includes agriculture and land use. This slide just sort of summarises the key sort of risks that were identified in the third risk assessment. Brendan touched on a few of these earlier, but really what we're interested in within the context of today's session are those risks to species and habitats, the risks from pest pathogens and invasive species, both in terms of the terrestrial environment, but also from agriculture and forestry. We've got impacts on soils, so changes in kind of seasonal aridity and wetness. We've got the risk to our natural carbon stores, so both in terms of carbon storage and opportunities for carbon sequestration. And then we've got the impacts around productivity itself. So how extreme weather events affect the ability to be productive on our farms and in our land. And then we've got things like risks to aquifers and agricultural land from a rising sea level. So particularly
Alex,
where saltwater intrusion comes in. So thank you to DEFRA for helping some of these slides that were provided. So this is their sort of highlight slide for the natural environment. And within the National Adaptation Programme, this is looking to support natural systems to adapt to climate change, and how this will be achieved through the sort of legal mechanisms to support biodiversity, water quality, and tree planting targets, among others. A few of the things of interest on this slide. So on the left-hand side there, we've got climate adaptation being built into the environmental land management schemes. We've got the restoration of peatland and increasing tree canopy and woodland cover, which farming and land use plays a key role in. And we've also got things like integrated pest management standards that will support in how chemicals are used within the environment, and incentivizing farmers and landowners to use sustainable methods that both support emissions reductions, but also improving the resilience of our land to better cope with climate threats. So in terms of the environmental land management schemes, this is government support for farmers to take adaptation actions, which can be done through a number of mechanisms. So the three core schemes within it are the Sustainable Farming Incentive, Countryside Stewardship, and Landscape Recovery. The idea is that ELMS will help to promote resilient and sustainable land management and farming practices going forward. And some examples of this might include sort of improvements to soil health, establishing new woodland, and supporting and reducing flood risk. ELMS has been designed in line with the Supplementary Green Book guidance, and the government's really aiming for 70% of farmers and farmland to be within the ELMS scheme by 2028. Another thing within the strategies, within the National Adaptation Programme, is local nature recovery strategies. These are being used to help consider the climate trends and hazards that are affecting local areas. They bring together local communities and decision makers and help to support locally specific adaptation measures that support habitat recovery, which will also indirectly support sort of farming and biodiversity. Another thing they're looking at is the land use framework. This is expected to be published in 2023. I think words back from May or June. I think they're running out of time, so I don't know if it is due in the next month or so. But the idea of the framework is to ensure the country meets its net zero and biodiversity targets. And through this will help farmers adapt to climate change whilst also continuing to produce high quality and affordable food. So in terms of agriculture and soils, there's a number of sort of action items. These include sort of incentivizing sustainable agricultural methods, paying for agroforestry systems, supporting natural flood management, introducing the integrated pest management standard, and investing money in on-farm reservoirs and trying to increase water storage within the agriculture sector by 66% by 2050. There's also a number of sort of information items within the plan. So establishing a healthy soil indicator, which will help to provide better information for monitoring, incorporating climate change impact into crop health, pest and risk analysis, investing in breeding research. So a lot of our ability to adapt will come through new varieties and species that will be more resilient to future climate, and trying to explore new or less used crops and the functions they might play. And then in terms of coordination, there's the Genetic Technology Act, which is looking to deliver drought and disease resistant crops. We're also looking at things like free advice to help farmers take adaptation actions, and the government's looking to work with water companies to develop comprehensive planning. And then finally around this piece is around sort of peatland and woodland. So there's ambitions to try and restore 280,000 hectares of peatland by 2050. There's an upcoming ban on the sale of peat for amateur gardening, and looking to work with the professional horticulture sector to accelerate their transition to peat-free alternatives. In terms of woodland, we're looking at increasing cover by 34,000 hectares by 2028. We're looking for policies that will be informed by projections and risk forecasts, so supporting tree planting in appropriate places, and looking at investments in funding that support high quality woodland creation, and also enhancing the quality, quantity and diversity of tree stocking areas. So just to finish with some sort of key messages, Brendan spoke about some of the kind of tangible adaptation actions that might be taken within agriculture. For government, this is more about providing those enabling conditions that support adaptation action. So whilst there are some actions being taken at the national level to support progress, as we're seeing through sort of the ELMS and the other ambitions that are coming forward, these will not address all the impacts. So there's plenty more that needs to be done. And as we've seen, some of these actions like the land use framework have yet to actually be published. So there are things that will happen over the coming years. In general, the rate of adaptation progress remains slow, as Brendan demonstrated. All four sort of devolved nations are still falling short of what's required. And as we're still experiencing day-to-day, extreme weather impacts are affecting farming systems. Current planned actions will not fully address all the risks associated with climate change, so new ideas and innovative technologies, etc., will be required. But what we can say is a resilient food and agriculture sector is possible with the right action, and there is very much a role for all parts of the supply chain to build resilience. And particularly for each part of that supply chain, adaptation is a local action and therefore dealing with local impacts. So there's only so much that can be done at sort of government level to help influence some of this stuff, and the role of each individual player will be important. So I will leave it there and pass back to you, Alex.
Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, Charles, for that. Just a reminder on your screen to get involved, slido.com, if you've got any questions relating to either of those presentations. And also, we have one more poll before we get into the panel discussion. Already got one question in, so we'd like more questions for the panel. But before we get into it, there is one final poll. This is a word cloud. So how would you describe adaptation, action or progress in your business or organization? So we're looking to generate a word cloud here. So if you could fill that in, how would you describe adaptation, action or progress in your own business or organization? That would be useful. And by the magic slow, yes, I was expecting a bit of that. There's some slow coming out. Slow is the main one. Aware, that's good. Some people are aware. So we've had a positive from slow to tortoise. Is that slower than slow? Probably, yes. Underway. So some people do have it underway. That's good. That's excellent. Any more for any more? Oh, I can see some further down. Expensive. That's a key factor, I guess. Work in progress, but at least it's in progress, I guess. Developing. Not getting a lot of unambitious, okay, at the start. So a lot of people, it's started, but it's slow, and it's I think the general backing up what Brendan said, that it's not enough, is what we're seeing from this word cloud. Evangelizing with a Z. Seen as unimportant. Oh, that's sad to read. But yeah, the general thing from that, yeah, work in progress and slow. So it's happening, but it's slow and it's a bit behind the clock, which is kind of what we saw from Brendan. Okay, conscious of time, let's get on to the panel discussion. You can keep answering that as you go through it. This is the panel. Let me introduce them. We've already met Brendan, so Brendan's sticking around to answer questions as well. But joining him, yeah, please do turn your cameras back on if you're on the panel. Joining him, we have Elizabeth Fuller. Lizzie is a scientist here at the Met Office and currently seconded into DEFRA's climate adaptation evidence team, supporting on the application of climate data to support policy development. Joining Lizzie, we have Mike Gooding from Farming Systems. He's a director. Mike is Farming Systems Director at the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, AHDB. He's also a director at RCMG Oxford Limited and chairman at Raft Solutions Limited, which looks for innovative research, advanced breeding and training solutions. Joining those two, we have James Clark. James is a research director at ADAS with over 45 years of experience in ADAS. James specializes in all aspects of production, especially sustainable agriculture, integrated farming, and impacts of arable farming on the environment. From the 1st of January, James will be the chair of the UK Expert Committee on Pesticides. So I'll be interested in what Brendan was saying earlier about pesticides. Joe is also joining. Joe grew up on his Joe Evans grew up on his farm in Herefordshire and spent much of the first decade of his career working for HSBC in Asia, working together with one of his farming tenants. Joe now runs the home farm as an extensive organic grazing enterprise. He has been involved with the CLA as chair of the Herefordshire branch and chair of the Environment Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, that is your panel. Welcome along, everybody. Thank you for being here. So I'm conscious of time, so let's keep our answers short if we can. First up, though, let's start with a broad question. Joe, maybe you want to come in on this one. What are the barriers stopping adaptation in the agriculture sector as you see them?
Thank you very much, Alex, and good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be here. I should add that I've been vice president of the CLA for 2 weeks, so you've got to be gentle with me. I'm just getting going in this new role. So I think it's very interesting to hear these discussions. I mean, I had a long meeting this morning with Janet Hughes from DEFRA about elms, and it makes me realise how, when looking at elms as one of the levers to be able to influence climate adaptation, is just one of many. And yet, for me and for our members, elms is the whole ball game at the moment in trying to understand how we can embrace the future policy regime to be able to meet the challenges of our time. In terms of the big decisions, the barriers, it's come up already. I think it is lack of knowledge, it's lack of data. I think being really clear about which levers to pull and when and why is challenging. I think I'm very conscious that I'm speaking to 31% of the audience being from government. So I think it's really important to say, and for you to pass up to your ministers, that you're pushing an open door from the land managing community, that we want to play a crucial role in climate adaptation, and more ambitiously than that, really, playing a part in reversing climate change and making wise decisions about our land in order to be able to solve some of the bigger problems that are before us. But it really is about data and knowledge. The other one is, and I think, Mike, you might want to come in on this as well, it is around, how should I put this, creating the right fiscal environment. You know, many of us are simple folks with a dog and a stick and some sheep, and not having an endless resource to be able to invest in climate change mitigations, even if there is grant funding down the track at some point. That ambiguity around what the policy and grant environment might look like is quite a scary place to be if you're a farmer. And you've got to remember that we're trying to do all of this at exactly the same time that we're coming out of BPS entirely in the next couple of years. So I would say knowledge, fiscal environment are the two sort of big barriers or challenges that we have to navigate as a landowning community.
Excellent stuff. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Joe. Mike's got his hand up there. Mike, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for the challenge. And I should just also point out that I'm a farmer still, and a farmer at heart. And I think one of the things, Alex, that is very interesting, and you often hear expressed, is that farmers are slow to adapt and resistant to change. Actually, fundamentally, that's an incorrect statement. As farmers, on a day-to-day business, we have to adapt. A day-to-day basis, we have to adapt very quickly and deal with a whole raft of challenges. I would say that some of the barrier to progress and the slow take up and adaptation is really because we as farmers are not clear about what is required. And that clarity of what we're trying to achieve, starting with some proper data, would be really helpful, and the right incentives to move forward. You would actually find that farmers change very quickly and do adapt. We have to. It's what we do naturally. And that raises a number of questions, really. Charles raised in his presentation, talked about there was a role for all parts of the supply chain. And flow of value through the supply chain, for me as a farmer food producer, is one of those key issues that we need to address to allow us to invest and be able to change the way we conduct our farming businesses. And that's a key point where government may well have a role to play, as well as wider society. So we need to think about things in a very holistic and perhaps much larger understanding. But I'm actually rather optimistic, because I know we can change, and we do change. And feeding 8.5 billion people on the planet over the next few years, for me as a farmer, is one heck of a marketing opportunity. So all the opportunities that are there, it's about how we open the doors and make the progression quicker.
Excellent. Yeah, really, really good to hear some optimism, Mike. That's also really good. James, do you want to come in on any of those points? I guess one of the questions we need, and one of the questions was raised in one of the presentations, how do you speed it up? What are the key things? Obviously, we've talked again about data and getting that across and communication, but how can we speed the whole process up?
I agree with what Mike and Joe said, but I'm also slightly worried that if we're not careful, everybody thinks this is someone else's problem or someone else to deal with it. When we've deliberately structured these webinars, and in the first one, we looked at what farmers and growers could do. We looked at what the food supply chain could do. And there are things that people can be doing now, and assessing their own risks in their own businesses would be a really good start, and starting to prioritize that. There are also, and we are trying to, or will do, I should say, in one of the earlier presentations, it was shown, not today, but before, if you want to look back to them, we're starting to help people by getting the Met Office presenting data now as to whether this event is going to happen 2 years in 10, 3 years in 10. And we had an interesting feedback that a lot of people on one of them were quite happy to start to move once it was 3 years in 10. So there's things we can now start to prioritize which actions need to be taken. But it's got to be a partnership between government and industry. I'd have no doubt that government and policies in government need to be more holistic, as we were just talking about. I won't repeat all of Mike's comments, but equally, we need to be thinking, what can I get on and do now, and how can I do it? And food supply chains are really important influencers. So it's not all about government doing things. It's also about the supply chain, which is really joined up in some areas, and can actually really influence change much more quickly than government can. So where is the right balance of these things is where I think we ought to also be focusing, not just on it. And we certainly got to not think it's someone else's problem and something come along. We know agriculture responds very quickly. Very finally, I'm sitting here with a report that was the hot, dry summer of 1995. I was around then. If anybody's got it, you reread it and you think there are things in there that we still haven't learnt now, 28-ish years later. But we also know that the hot summer of 2022 was a very different hot summer to the summer of 2023. And for different reasons, the responses would have been different and the impacts were different. So we need to help people in understanding how they are resilient to those different years.
Good points, James. Thank you very much. Lizzie, I'll come to you now with more of a scientific question, if I may, just around the policies. And we talked a lot about adaptation, but we also talk a lot about net zero. So how is adaptation being considered for that plan to get to net zero? Because we often talk about net zero and the mitigation, but how is adaptation considered within the net zero plan?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and government really do consider them both holistically. So a lot of the adaptation actions in the natural environment do consider kind of net zero policies, like the need for protecting peatlands and also planting more woodland that, of course, is resilient to the future climate that we know we will experience. And on a policy level, a lot of the teams that are working on adaptation also have net zero briefs. So, you know, these people are thinking quite holistically across different sectors and different systems, which is also really encouraging. And also kind of at a governance level, a lot of the ministerial boards that consider one element also consider the other, which is also great.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'm conscious we've had a few questions in, so let's get to some of the questions from the audience, if we may. Graham Madge has asked a really interesting question here around adaptation and does adaptation suggests to many a drop in yield. You talk about planting more trees, but that presumably reduces then the field size and a drop in yield. So his question is, to many, the principle of adaptation may suggest a drop in yields, and with a growing population, as we've already touched on, does that suggest a future challenge for food security in the UK? We've talked about it being an opportunity, but is there that conflict when does adaptation always mean a drop in yields, or other ways around that? Would anyone in particular like to come into that? Mike, thanks for putting your hand up. Oh, and everyone's up for answering that. We'll go to you first, Mike.
Okay, well, I'll try and keep it very brief then, Alex, as everybody wants to input into this point. I think it's a very interesting question, and many of the things that we do look at in agriculture are really about taking the pressure off the system and building a more resilient system, which often means a drop in yield. Classically, I was trained as a farmer and I fully understand delivering more tons per hectare or more litres per cow. It's sort of ingrained in my DNA as being a positive thing. Actually, I think the challenge is we need to change the narrative. We need to change the narrative to the point where I start to appreciate that perhaps if I produce less tons per hectare, but produce a range of other values that wider society does value and makes a difference to my business, then that's just as good a thing as maximizing my yield. So we probably need to talk much more about optimizing things within farming systems and understand that the true value is that whole systems approach. Of course, that's an easy challenge for us with full stomachs. I attended a presentation the other day where the suggestion was that by 2050, because of climate change, we'll see 3.8 billion people move further north. And when you have a full stomach, you have the luxury of worrying about a world of problems. If you haven't eaten for 3 days, you have one fundamental problem. So I think the other thing that we have to get our head around is that the challenges are going to change and could continually change quite rapidly. So rather than thinking that we can find some sort of blueprint solution that is going to deal with the rest of time, we have to learn that we are going to continually have to change and adapt. So I think we're in for a very exciting time, which means a much greater intellectual understanding of both the demands and the supply challenges are part of our daily narrative.
And I guess for that you need more and more accurate forecasts of the future as well, which is where the Met Office comes in, and myself and Lizzie. So yeah, we're up for the challenge as well. But that's really important. That thing that change keeps changing as well, right? It's not just let's make a change now and we'll be fine for 2050. No, we won't. We have to constantly keep that change going. You were nodding your head there, Joe. Do you want to come in on that?
Thank you, Alex. I wish I'd gone before Mike because he was so erudite in his response.
He was very good, wasn't he? Yeah.
So I'm not going to do the irritating thing and say it all again, but I think the business around changing the narrative and regenerative farming is a term often bandied about. I passionately believe that there isn't a necessary trade-off between delivering environmental outcome and delivering food. They are not mutually exclusive. I think that the challenges around our cropping choices, and there's another question that I see on the Slido about land use change, I think is relevant to this discussion as well. Because I think that, to give you one anecdote to highlight the point, that there was a farmer acquaintance of mine in Herefordshire that was very big about how much he fed the nation with his couple of thousand acres of potatoes. And then the price changed and he started growing maize to chuck in a biodigester. Now that's not feeding the nation. And so I think there is a really important grown-up discussion that we as an industry need to have with one another about making sure that we make wise choices about our land use. Now, you can't blame the guy, he's following the market. So that's where government needs to really step in and help guide us through sensible fiscal policy and essential agricultural policy to encourage us to grow the right crop in the right place. So there's a whole raft of things that speak to one another, but I haven't quite followed through the maths around what happens with 3.6 billion people moving north and whether or not if we did all optimize our land use choices, we'd get there. But I agree with Mike entirely that as a community, land managers are well up for the challenge and we can be pretty nimble. We've just got to have the conditions right to be able to make that happen.
And there is previous of, being able to adapt to a huge population rise as happened last century anyway. And we were able to adapt rightly or wrongly. James, did you have anything to come back on that? Or
I think we've got to not only talk about land use and the changing land use, and Joe's made perfectly valid points and highlighted really that one government department in that case was pulling against another government department, and the two priorities weren't tied together. So we need to address that as we go forward. But I really, we could solve a lot of the emissions of the country by planting trees and getting rid of cattle. That's far too simplistic, and we've got to move beyond that discussion. And we've got to look at which breeds of cattle are much more efficient. And I was over in Northern Ireland, in Belfast last week, hearing about some of the work they're doing there about cattle that have lower emissions, for example. So there's some really exciting technologies as well. So we must talk about the way we manage land and the things that use land as much as land use change. And we need to think of the two in parallel all the time to get the optimum blend. And it isn't easy. We need to accept that, but we can make significant progress in some of them. But we also have to change some of our expectations. I think it isn't necessarily about a drop in yields. It's also about the differences in when things happen. Seasonality of production is perhaps something we might come back to. Local and seasonal got an earlier on the call yesterday. So I won't revisit that. People can do that. But we do need to think about seasonality as much as locality, and we need to get those balances right.
Brendan, is that something that came up in the report about the changing needs for that seasonality in your research?
Yeah. I mean, there was evidence to show that there has been a shift in the advent of spring over recent years. I don't think within the industry it has really impacted it too much. I was just going back to the last point around the impact on yields. I think it really does depend on whether you take a long-term or a short-term perspective in terms of how you deal or how you conduct your business. Many of the decisions that you make now, although they may seem profitable at the moment, if you take a longer-term perspective on it going forward and you start thinking about, are these really sustainable going forward, then overall it could potentially be a lot more beneficial for the businesses over the longer term. And the last thing that you would want to do is to make decisions now that would lock in things that could potentially result in issues going forward. There will be compromises. There's no clear solutions. It's a very difficult decision. We're trying to compete a range of different policies in the way we use land, both for food security, for the environment, for mitigation. But I think there are ways that we can find a balance between the three of them. It's just, I think it just takes a bit more careful thinking around there. And for many of the decisions that we make now, as I say, going back to the point around longer term decisions, if you look at it, take a longer term perspective, some of these decisions around adaptation or adaptation implementation, they are sensible business decisions with a lot over the longer term. So yeah, I think it does take the different perspectives that need to be taken into account.
And is that, again, a data and a communication-based issue as well? People need the data and the information to make those longer-term decisions.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're trying to do in the next climate change risk assessment, try to make it a little less dense, make it a little more user-friendly, so that we can actually go to the people on the ground that are making the decisions and implementing the actions so that they can use it and they can understand the long-term risk and not just the kind of observed risks that are happening at the moment.
Mike, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to extend a bit of what Brendan has just said. Of course, and what Brendan is illustrating is a sort of transition. We need to move from one area to a next in our practices. And I must be very careful not to sound like a whinging farmer at this point. We usually complain about the weather, Alex, but also we complain a lot about the economics of this. And what we've got to do, if we are expecting a change in behaviours and farm management decisions, is find a way to make that transition a sustainable one. And that means at a business level, it needs to be profitable. As a tenant farmer, I have to pay the rent every quarter, and that's quite a focus on the mind. So if I'm going to change my farm management decisions that mean that my profitability is going to be affected in a negative way, somehow we've got to transition through that period. The good news is actually, when you do focus on things like animal health and welfare and productivity, on soil health, on environmental things, usually it comes out with an economic advantage at the end of the day. So we need to grab those opportunities and celebrate that. It's about this change in mindset that we need to bring about to help people transition through this period. And there's an obvious opportunity for government support and intervention. And I don't really want to talk about support and subsidy as being essential. I think it's actually one of the things that has retarded our adaptation to change and taking on new ideas. But there's some form of helping us get through that transitional period and retain a profitable business status, which is essential. Otherwise, it doesn't happen.
Sure. James, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I think this long-term, short-term thing is actually very important, and you know, a lot of land managers and farmers are faced with a very short-term horizon of how do I make the bank repayments or whatever else it is in the short term, and you only have to look out the window now and realize what a wet autumn we've had, and we mustn't confuse long-term changes in climate with the immediate weather that we're facing. And whilst the two are not unrelated, as you meteorologists will know better than I do, actually it's that latter one that gives people a real immediacy of issues that they're having to deal with, and also will drive some of the things that, so we will have, we know already there will be a much smaller area of autumn planted crops. They tend to be higher yielding than the spring alternatives, and they tend to be more economically viable. So we're immediately got a difference this year that we'll be looking at, and that is going to be a significant change. But I also wanted just to think that we also need to start, and this is picking up on one of the other questions about public engagement effectively. I think we need to start communicating more about some of the challenges and what they'll mean. I interestingly picked up a turkey from a farm last year, and it explained that this turkey was lighter than usual because it didn't eat as much in a hot summer that we'd had. And those sorts of things will become the norm. Producing lettuce is really difficult when you've got temperatures above 30 degrees centigrade. So we're going to start to see these things impacting more frequently on consumers, and we need to start explaining that and having a joined up discussion between them, whilst the evidence, the R&D can catch up, and we'll start to see turkeys that might eat more in hot weather or lettuces that are more resilient. in the short term, we're going to have a more engagement about why there aren't things on the shelves or they're different to what people used to see.
There was a question in the comments about what actions people need to do, and that, well, one of the actions that people will kind of realise, and so that's good that people will actually, you know, it's actually impacting their Christmas dinners, and it's going to be pretty significant. We are pretty much out of time, but I do want to come to Joe because he's got his hand up. So, Joe, to you.
That's kind, thank you. And sorry if you wanted to take a question, but building on James's point just there, and I know you're the last person I need to mention this to, Alex, but when it comes to water management from a meteorological perspective, you've got to remember that in what we do, it's about water in the wrong place at the wrong time. And actually, things like government coming to the boil on how to deal with competing, you know, low-lying reclaimed agricultural land. Does that become a managed floodplain, or does that become somewhere we grow crops? We need help from government to help decide that. But we also need to acknowledge that at certain points of the year, certainly this summer just gone, here on my farm, my borehole dried up. And that happened all over the country. So I think it's the sort of scarcity and plentifulness of water in the wrong places is a complex scientific beast that is far beyond the wit of me. But I think that we've got to be very careful that we don't advocate for policies that are too generalist on these issues. And it is very much about where you are in the country and the specific kind of enterprise that you're trying to manage.
The wrong kind of rain. Thank you for that, Joe. As with all of these webinars we've had through this week, it become very obvious that things become very complicated very, very quickly indeed. But it's been really useful to have these discussions. I think one learning maybe from the next time is that we need another half hour for these webinars as well, because we're just kind of getting going. But I do kind of have to wrap it up there. The same happened on Monday and on Wednesday as well. So a huge thank you to all of our panelists. This webinar has been recorded if you've missed it. So if you've registered for this webinar, you will get an email afterwards that does have a link in it as well. And there'll be details on there about how you can contact the organisers or anyone else as well if you've got any follow-up questions or feedback. But we are out of time. So one more final thank you to our panelists, and thank you very much to everyone who's been involved in asking questions as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. You've been superb over the last 3 webinars, and thank you to everyone in the Met Office and ADAS that's helped put these together. It's been a big endeavour and hopefully very informative and excellent discussion. So thank you, everyone, and we'll close it there.
Thanks very much, all. Cheerio.
Thank you.